Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate you guys joining me today. This is our inaugural uh, meet where I'm going to sit and just go through some of the thoughts I have on some of the pertinent things that are coming up within our day-to-day management. Right now, it's a heavy budgets part of the year. A lot of our corporations. Probably around 60% of our corporations have year-end budgets of December 31st. So budgets are quite extensive going in our office right now, meeting the requirements. So what I thought I'd do today is I just talk briefly about how it is we look at preparing a budget, what it is we do, what it is that goes through our heads, what kind of things that we need to consider as we put together a draft budget ready to send out to the board of directors for their review and input. And there's a few key components, but there's no hard and fast rule. There is everyone's a little different on what they prioritize, even so much as the properties themselves. As we get to know the properties, they help us understand things that are important to them, and that affects how we put together a budget. So I'm gonna work today to just kind of keep it generalized, and then at the very end, I'd like to have any questions put to me, and hopefully I can spend some time and answer those. So I hope that this gives you as board members a little bit more confidence as you sit at that board table and consider these draft budgets that are put in front of them. So as you're aware, there's a legal component that we as managers, you as boards of directors need to be aware of, coming from the act, coming from the regulations. And essentially, the Condominium Act requires that every corporation must maintain an operating account for day-to-day expenses, as well as a separate reserve fund for major repairs and replacement. And the board is the one that is responsible for the values of those components. The regulations require that owners receive these operating budgets a month in advance of the year end so that they have time to prepare for, well, if there is increases, they need to have some time to adjust to that. So, what is it that we do as management when we start to look at a budget? The very first thing we do is we have to gather a few things and have it readily at hand. We have to have the last audit, the audited financials from the auditor. We take the 9 months of the year that we're currently in, the 9-month actual numbers. We then gather information from government. We're looking for inflationary pressures. What is the government giving us as far as inflationary numbers? Have we received notices from vendors that there's going to be increases? Utilities, what are we looking at for that? We look at contract renewals. Have any contract renewals come up that are going to be part of this new budget? And then we look at the operating float, and we need to consider contingency targets. So those are the stuff that we gather initially. The very first thing that we look at is the operating float. How much money do we have in the operating account at any given point over the course of the previous months? And what we're looking for is we're looking for the lowest value. What was the lowest amount that we drew the operating account down to? That is that is really important because what we need to understand is how far down have we taken it, and what does our risks then entail in the event of an upheaval, any kind of shock, anything like that. So those upheavals, that shock to the system, it could be a high utility bill from, let's just say, like an unseen leak, a water leak happening, an irrigation leak underground, let's say for the summer, and it takes a while to locate it. Um, Windstorm, that's a good one. Windstorm causing damages to the property. Um, that can take an operating and repair budget line item and just inflate it like crazy. Or the one that really is troublesome are the insurance deductibles. Do we have the ability to withstand a call on to meet an insurance deductible, or heaven forbid, two? Or like we had one time, we had three insurance deductibles within a 5-week period. That was a tough one. So, do we have enough in the operating account to handle shocks like that? Next, we take those historical trends. We look at the previous year's audited financials. Sometimes we have to go back into even further previous year's financials and see if we can see what the property has done. Now, that's specifically when we have a new property that we've taken over. We need to go back and we need to really analyze and bring forward to see what kind of continuity those numbers have. We need to see what the current 9-month actuals are so that we can extrapolate for the following 3 months. And then that will give us a picture of how the year is going to shape up. It's not exact, but it gives us an idea. Then we start to layer in the inflation. Where do we see inflationary pressure? Are we getting notices from the insurance company that, to expect a 5%, an 8% increase? Are we getting vendor notices where they're saying to us, we're going to be looking for a 3% increase on our next contract? We need to ensure the budget reflects these actual performances and then the known upcoming changes. Then what we do is we look at what kind of changes have happened on site over the course of the period since our last budget. So let me give you an example. Was a new boiler installed in the building, a more efficient boiler? We don't know exactly the consumption numbers that are going to be on those boilers, but we can assume if we're getting more efficient, we can work with the provider and have them help us understand what that level of efficiency is, and we can incorporate some of that into our budget line items for natural gas. What if irrigation? The corporation had gone from a 3-day irrigation cycle down to a 2-day irrigation cycle. Did that work for the corporation? Are they going to continue that going forward, or are they going to go back to a 3-day? Those are the things that we look at for the on-site changes. And then we have to look at the impact on the owners. We put these numbers in, and we have to understand how it affects the owners as well. We have to look at the historical increases that the owners have had to sustain. And is there room for or more appetite for another increase if it's necessary? Or how do we frame that for the owners? We don't want to put undue hardship on the owners, but we still have to fund the corporation's needs. So how do we take that knowledge and incorporate it into our budget? So In the past, has the corporation been giving larger than normal increases to the owners? Was it due to building up the operating account? And if so, has the objective been met? Can we back off on some of the inflationary numbers? Can we back off on some of the contingencies we need to build in to the budget because we have a substantial enough float? Those are the kind of things that we look at when we start the process of dealing with putting the numbers down on the paper. One of the things that we also have to take into account is we're looking at, I like to have our properties look at a contingency strategy, literally written right onto the budget. And the reason I like a contingency, I like budgeting a contingency amount for every month and actually transferring that amount into a separate bank account. The goal is to gradually build and maintain that bank account, investing the proceeds in short-term investments, getting a little better than bank account investment numbers. But that is to help with actually, I liken it to if we can keep or get a contingency account sufficient to sustain one or two insurance deductibles, the ability for that corporation to absorb shocks to the system is phenomenal. It is fabulous. Sometimes even just a little bit goes a long way. So the reason I like the contingency, as opposed to putting any excess money or things like that into the reserve, is the reserve is restricted. You can only be used for major repairs or replacements, things that are identified on the reserve fund study. Whereas a contingency is completely within the board of directors' purview. They can use it for deductibles. They can use it to pay their insurance premium without having to, in full, without having to resort to making payments over the course of the year. Having a contingency account allows us to draw the operating account down lower than we normally would because we have that contingency as a fallback. So it just gives the board of directors and the management greater flexibility. When we get to the end of the budget, the last line on the budget is the reserve fund allocation. And as I indicated before, we must have that allocation every year. Now, the studies, it identifies the major components of the property. It estimates their remaining life. It estimates the replacement costs. And from all that, it recommends a contribution schedule. Now, it's a recommendation. But what happens if the major components are aging quicker than expected? What happens if the board of directors needs to look at adjusting how the expenditures from the reserve are being handled? Let me give you an example on this. What if the reserve fund says we've got a budgeted line item to paint the exterior of the building? Okay, great. But then you look a little further, and 5 years later, they've got a line item where all the sealant around the windows and doors, the expansion joints is to be replaced. Well, I'll tell you something from experience. If you can do the sealant prior to the painting and then overcoat the sealant with the paint, the longevity of your sealant is going to be much, much longer. And so why would you go and paint the building 5 years later, cut out the caulking, and then have to do touch-ups on the painting? Doesn't make sense. So part of a board of directors job, part of us as management's job, is to look at those things and come up with a strategy whereby we may withdraw more money than what the um, reserve fund suggests, or we may do the exact opposite. We may choose to do some repairs to a capital project as opposed to replacement to extend the life. So there's no hard and fast rule, but it gives us a guideline as to what we need to put as a member contribution for the upcoming budget. So when we look at this line item, it is also one of the subjective areas that boards quite often have us look at. So an example I'm going to give you here is we put in a number and we come up with a 0% increase on the budget. After all the numbers are put in, after all of the inflationary pressures, we've had some efficiencies that we've been able to find, and we come and we put the reserve fund number in. And hypothetically, it's a 0%. But we look back at what has gone on the property for the last 2, 3, 4 years. How have the owners been positioned for increases? Did they just come through a period of large increases to their budget? Okay. Then we get back to the part where I was saying we need to take into account what the owners have had to do in the past. But if there's been very small, reasonable increases to the owners' contributions, now the board has something that they need to think about. Do we increase the this 0% budget to be a small increase budget as opposed to holding it flat? Because there's a strategy involved here. And the strategy is that, first of all, there's only one pocket that this money comes from, and it's the owners. A small increase in the fees is far more easy to sustain than a cash call. And if we can position the corporation with small increases for longer periods, the better it is for the owners in the long run. So these are things that the board needs to take a look at as the budgets reach their desk, so to speak. These are things that we as management and the board of directors will talk about. What is the strategy? So getting down to the end of it, at that point, we then put this in front of the board of directors, this tentative budget. We have a meeting and we go through it line by line. We have an explanation of where the increases are coming from or where the drops are coming from. And then you as a board of directors get to have a say. It's your budget. You're the ones that are ultimately responsible for voting and approving these budgets, going through them and making sure that they are what you as a corporation need in the final hour. So that essentially is the long and the short of how we put together a budget. So I know that there's a lot more that we could talk about when it comes to the reserve items, but I've been thinking about, I think what I'll do is I will make that a specific item and we won't lump it in because it's quite a large item. So I think we'll take that into account at a later date. So at this point, I'm going to open up the floor, and I've got some questions here that I can start to answer, and I'll see what I can do. So by all means, if you guys have questions, down on the bottom of your screen, there is a section that is Q&A, and pop that up, type in some of your questions, and I'll get to it. So Let's start with a first question here. We've got a question with the painting and sealing order of operations example. That is a pretty technical issue that a board may not have expertise about. Whose job is it to have that technical know-how and to keep an eye on the reserve fund study and property maintenance needs? I imagine over the course of years to ensure that maintenance and projects are done in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible. Okay, good question. It's a tough one in that not every manager, very few managers have the technical knowledge to be able to understand what it takes to do construction or what the buildings require in a logical progressive need. That is where you need, I know with UrbanTec, we have, my background is in that area, but not a lot of management companies have someone like me that they can draw on, but they can draw on their contractors to help them understand. I know it takes time, but a lot of contractors are more than willing to sit down with property managers, help them understand some of these progressive issues. A good contractor, painting contractor, going out will come back and say to the property manager, listen, it's great that you're inviting us to do the painting, but we need to look at that caulking as well. That's what I want our contractors to do with our managers. Let's do something different. Asphalt. I know that we came across this a little while back on one of our properties. We needed to get a bunch of asphalting done, but there was a retaining wall that was slated for replacement right up against the asphalt. The retaining wall was something that we did, 3 or 4 years in advance. I can't remember how many years in advance, but these are the kind of things that you take into account, and hopefully your vendors help you as a manager with these items. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay. Next question. Are small special assessments a good alternative strategy to increasing condo fees? We've been talking a lot about how the condo fee increases can impact ability to attract buyers when selling. This is a little bit tricky because it is a strategy. And depending on who you talk to, they're saying, I hear, well, that's not really legal. It's a gray area. But here's what I say. When I go to my boards of directors and my corporations, one of the things that I have to stress with them is there's only one pocket that this money comes from, and it's yours. And you as a building, you as a corporation, you as a board of directors, with knowing the people in your buildings or knowing them better than we do at some part. What is it you think your owners would prefer? And this is something you could ask at an AGM because that's a really valid question. I know that when people go and look at purchasing a property, one of the very first things that they do when they're looking at a condo is they look at, well, what's the condo fees? Okay. And so they see, let's just say $800 as opposed to others in the neighborhood for $700. Okay. Do they just pass on and go, oh, that's just too expensive? Okay, possibly. What they don't see is what that $800 is buying or what that $700 is not buying and the surprises that is going to come up in a year or 2 or 3. So when you're asking about keeping it reasonable on the condo fee side and doing small special assessments. I say it is a strategy. And if the board of directors wishes to go down that road, understand that it's not the act requires that a budget be prepared sufficient to the needs of the corporation. Okay. So technically, you shouldn't be using special assessments to increase the operating accounts balance because of lack of funds coming into the account through a less than adequate budget. But again, I don't know what to say to this question. It's a strategy. It is used. Many properties use this strategy. I have never heard of it ever becoming a legal issue. I'm not saying it hasn't. I've just never heard of it becoming a legal issue because no one has objected to it. So I can't advise you legally, but that's all I'm saying. It is a strategy, and if a board of directors chooses to do it, we will implement that. Hopefully, that's answers your question. Got another question that says, what is the best approach when looking at replacing windows? One side of the building at a time, certain windows per year to spread out the cost? Oh, that's a big one. That depends on so many factors. One of the difficult things is when you do spot repairs like this, then you start to have more difficulty creating a reserve fund that is cognizant of a multi-year phased in approach to lifespan. Then you get into issues with, is the same product available year after year? Or does the product change and therefore the look can change? Then it becomes an issue of who gets the windows first. And we hear this all the time. Why is it always that the board members get their windows first? Well, that's not how it is, but it can be how it's perceived. What are the parameters of the other components that are not being replaced? So if you take a building on the south side, for instance, it takes a lot more weather damage than something on the north side. So could windows be or siding or what have you be deteriorating at a quicker rate on the south side? Absolutely. So this is part of the strategy that is really difficult to answer, because what I like to do in a case like this is I like to put the options in front of the board. What would it cost today to do the whole building? Because there is efficiencies of scale. Doing a multi-year project require the contractors to factor in startup and takedown. So those costs will be reflected in multi-year. There'll be the increased costs related to inflationary pressures on the components, inflationary pressures on labor. Are you going to have the same teams installing the windows going forward or installing the product going forward on multi-year phases? These are things that the board is going to have to know, and they need to have the pricing in front of them. What we can extrapolate if we do it over, say, a 3-year or a 5-year period, they need to know these numbers. And again, not one answer fits all, but that's about the best that I can say, is gathering the information, putting it in front of the boards, seeing what makes sense for the corporation at that time. All right, next question is, given that severe weather is on the rise, do you suggest that board members maintain reserve funds greater than the recommendations from engineering studies? Here again, I would look at what the corporation has expended out over the last years. Have they replaced more capital components at a greater speed than what the reserve fund has allotted, which would, in essence, draw down the value of the reserve fund, but your capital components now have a lifespan that's 1 year or 2 years old, as opposed to 35 years old and reaching the end. That these are good questions, but they're tough questions in that there's no one answer to meet all the needs. You have to look at this organically again, and you have to see where the future, once you take out those components, has that um, drop of the requirements for the future. Is it the same as where you are in the reserve bank account or in the reserve investments? Are you very close? So even though the reserve fund says, number A, by the time you take that out, are you sort of close? My rule of thumb is it's an organic process. We do the best we can to not draw down a corporation's reserve fund to a level that it's not able to withstand a shock, like an underground water break, something like that. But again, to your point, the weather is a tough one that is playing havoc with Calgary buildings. We are I don't have a simple answer for that. It is just something that is organic, and we do have to look at it year after year after year. That is why the reserve funds need to be done every 5 years. That is why we as managers need to work with the boards every single year when it comes budget time. Are we going to look at any capital projects for the next fiscal year? I'm not adverse to drawing down the reserve fund lower than what is suggested, provided we've got a reasoning for it. And we can justify it to the owners and justify it to the reserve fund planners. And honestly, sometimes I've asked the boards to allow us to go and get an update to a reserve fund midterm, just as a quick update, just to help us understand better where the numbers come in. So I'm hoping that answers your question. I've got another question. Some
I
more.
think we are
Sorry.
coming to the end because it's only 30 minutes webinar.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? There's a couple more questions. Do you mind if I just quickly whip through these couple questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Let me just see here. Okay. Can a certain expenses or repairs be funded from the reserve fund instead of the operating budget? And how do you decide this? This is one that I love because funding it from the reserve it allows us to maintain the operating account without sustaining that cost on the operating account. And at the end of the year, if the auditor does not agree with those marginal requests, those items that are pretty sure that they could go into the reserve, could be classified as a reserve expense. It's not clearly stated in the reserve fund that this is a component, but it sure seems like it could be. I want those put into the reserve expenditures so that the board then has greater flexibility going forward. Okay. Why do we need such large insurance budgets? Just because the corporation has a mandate by law that it must be fully insured. We only have a few insurers, underwriters who will insure the corporation. There's only a few brokerages that will insure corporations, and yeah, competition is not as like it once was. And with all the storms, like the question that was brought up earlier, the weather related issues, these are having a great deal of impact on what it is we do. So with that, I think we're gonna quit. We're gonna call it a day. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I thank you for your questions. Guys, any questions, let me know. My email is there. You can always send me an email and I'll do my best to answer them the best way I can. And appreciate you guys taking the time to join us. So thank you very much, everyone, and good day.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.